Today we have a final session of our global symposium. So today's final session's presenter is the Professor Kaylyn Schiff from Purdue University. And, we also hosted two discussants, Professor Seok-Jin from GSPA, Seoul National University, and Professor Myungl Kim from Myungl University. Myungl University is one of the top private university located in Seoul Metro. So let's start. Kaylyn, you have 30 minutes, about 30 minutes.
Great. Thanks so much for having me, Professor Kim, and thanks so much, Dr. Chung, for organizing, and thanks to the Center of Intelligent Society and Policy for inviting me. I'm Kaylyn Jackson Schiff. I'm an assistant professor at Purdue University, and I also co-direct the Governance and Responsible AI Lab, or GRAIL. Today, I'm going to be discussing a paper that was recently published in Public Administration Review. And this is a paper that looks at the institutional factors that affect citizen support and perceptions of AI in government. So I'm going to talk about the work that we did in this project, and then I'll also spend some time at the end of the presentation talking about where our work is going next, the work that we're doing to continue and extend this project. This work is collaborative work that is a multidisciplinary team, including political scientists, policy scholars, and criminologists. So it was a really great opportunity to work with individuals from lots of different backgrounds on this work. And my collaborators include Daniel Schiff, as well as colleagues from the University of South Carolina and the University of Utah. All right. So I mentioned that we look at the institutional factors that affect citizen support for AI in government. And the particular case that we explore is the use of AI in policing or in law enforcement. As many of you are probably aware, there are many instances and uses for AI in law enforcement. This includes the concept of predictive policing. You're using predictive models, algorithms to determine where to send police officers to prevent crime. This also includes facial recognition, surveillance for things like crowd control. This includes monitoring social media. It even includes the use of robotics in some applications, such as for diffusing explosive devices. So there are a whole host of ways that law enforcement is using technology, and AI in particular. And this is really important because the police are a very frequent way in which individuals have direct contact with government. It's a frequent presence in society and is often the face of government for many individuals in many communities. And so this is also relevant to the context here in South Korea. Doing a quick browsing of some news headlines, I noticed, and you all may have additional comments or thoughts about this, but AI use in policing in South Korea includes the use of AI for predicting crimes or for preventing drug trafficking, and is even including the use of police forces to identify deepfakes. We heard a little bit yesterday about the problem of deepfakes, and the police in Korea are starting to tackle this challenge of preventing the misuse of our information systems through the creation of deepfakes. In the United States, there's also been a lot of conversation about AI in policing. And this has led to attitudes on sort of both ends of the spectrum. So the first two headlines that I have here are pointing to recognized problems with the use of AI in policing. Facial recognition and AI get the evil eye from community groups and governments. There were concerns about how AI was being used in New York City by the police and in child services. I should also note that this is AI use in policing not only for external cases in which AI is used for applications involving members of the public, but there are also instances in which AI is being used for internal purposes. As the third headline indicates here, Aurora, Colorado, and other locations are starting to use AI to detect officer misconduct, to review body camera footage. And the last headline here is sort of pointing to, again, this variation in attitudes and preferences toward police use of AI. There's been a conversation over this technology called ShotSpotter, automated gunshot detection tools. And Chicago, we heard Adam speak yesterday as a representative from Chicago, has been in a debate back and forth over whether this technology is good for society or is harmful. And so in this last headline, there's actually a relatively substantial group fighting for the use of this technology that others suggest could potentially be biased or not work as accurately as it should, suggesting that there is really divided and varied public opinion on the use of AI in policing. So that leads to sort of one of our big questions as a starting point for this study. What shapes public support for AI in policing? To explore this in more detail, we really wanted to get into, again, these institutional factors, these factors that are related to the context, the agencies, the actors that are deploying AI systems. And we explored this through a survey experiment with a representative sample of over 4,000 US adults. A really nice thing about this symposium is that we've seen projects from a range of different methodologies, a range of different approaches to gathering evidence. And so today I'll be presenting results from a survey experiment, getting some quantitative data that's really aimed at causal identification. In this experiment, the treatments were informational vignettes describing hypothetical and proposed uses of AI in law enforcement. And again here, the key is that there's variation in the institutional context in which these tools are deployed. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. As for outcomes, we wanted to understand impacts on citizen support for the use of these tools, their trust in the actors who are deploying the tools, and also their willingness to contribute taxes and data to these initiatives, thinking about some real-world, potentially behavioral outcomes associated with these use cases. And to preview our findings, we find that in general, individuals are more favorable toward local law enforcement use as compared to higher level or national level law enforcement use of AI. We find less evidence that the targets of AI decisions and that agency capacity to actually effectively deploy these tools are as important. And we also find some evidence of differences in opinion by partisanship and race, and I'll get into that as well. All right, so to briefly describe the theoretical foundation and related literature on AI adoption in government, there's been a whole host of work that addresses the impacts on and also the preferences of bureaucrats. So this is a whole line of literature that's thinking about automated discretion, algorithmic bureaucracy, systems level or screen level bureaucracy. And a lot of this has, again, really focused on bureaucrats as the individuals who are impacted by AI adoption. A difference with this study is that we're looking at members of the public who are also impacted and have their preferences shaped by use of technology in government. There's also been generally an emphasis, not only in the public administration literature, but also in society broadly, on the technological features of AI systems. You've probably heard a lot about transparency, fairness, explainability, effectiveness. This is not to say that these aren't important things to continue studying, but as I'll talk about a little bit more, we think that socio-political, institutional, structural, and contextual factors are also really important to understand when we're thinking about public support for and public contributions to AI in government, especially given that government has a specific obligation and relationship to uphold public values. And it's something that I argue a lot in my work that explores public opinion on AI. Public attitudes about these technologies matter. They matter for democratic governance. They matter to elected officials who are supposed to represent the opinions and preferences of their constituents. They matter for accountability. Is government acting in a way that comports with public expectations and public values? Especially in policing, the context for this study, where public attention and opinions, especially in the United States, are quite heightened at the moment. But as I sort of previewed at the beginning, with the differences in opinions over ShotSpotter and the differences in opinions about AI and policing broadly, public preferences aren't perfectly clear yet regarding how AI, if at all, should be deployed by government. There are mixed results across studies that look at different policy domains or different use cases of AI. This is typically entailed just making comparisons between, for example, education and policing or healthcare and policing. And we really try to dive deeply into a fixed use case to understand the different dimensions that impact public attitudes. There's even some evidence that some theoretically important factors, some of these technical features, technological features, may not matter to the public as much as we might expect. Some recent research shows that explainability or transparency might not be as key of drivers of public attitudes as we might expect. So the big takeaway, the big idea for our study is that more attention needs to be devoted to the institutional factors that shape public perceptions of AI in government. This is probably not surprising to a group that studies public administration and public policy, but definitely something that we felt needed to be highlighted even more in the literature. So contextual factors, not only technological features matter, and the core concept here is that we really think that citizens' baseline opinions of and trust in the actors and institutions that implement AI are a really key driver of attitudes toward AI adoption in government. Okay, so to go into detail about the institutional factors that we explore, I'll walk through several of them. I'll note that these aren't meant to be comprehensive or the full list of institutional factors that matter. We definitely encourage us all to continue thinking about, exploring, investigating additional factors that matter. But to start somewhere, we explore three in particular in this study. And the first is bureaucratic proximity. This is the idea that the institutional or geographic closeness of bureaucrats to members of the public matters. And this relates to the concept of community embeddedness. When you have local representatives, local street level bureaucrats who perhaps have more knowledge of the community, this can lead to greater trust and greater perceptions that these individuals would hold the community's interest to heart when using AI tools. If you think about how local level officials may take information from AI systems, they may perhaps be able to better identify that a recommendation isn't exactly right for a certain community or doesn't comport with the community's values. They may have additional experience, knowledge, relationships with the community that impacts how they use AI systems. And this relates to the literature on trust gaps in federal systems that consistently shows that individuals have greater trust in local level institutions. So this leads to our hypothesis that the public would have a greater preference for local sheriff versus national level FBI use of AI in the context of the United States, where sheriffs are more in charge of local level law enforcement and the FBI is a national level organization. We also thought that the algorithmic target would be important. So algorithmic targets are the individuals or groups that are subject to the decisions or recommendations by algorithms. And we specifically distinguish between external or public versus internal or bureaucratic targets. So are AI systems making decisions that affect the public externally, or in the case of policing, police officers themselves internally? And we think that key concepts here involve individuals' baseline trust in bureaucrats, as well as their perceptions of members of the public, the deservingness of protection, or the deservingness of perhaps sanctions of public targets. And so based on this, we develop a hypothesis that individuals will have a greater preference for internal versus external targets, given considerations over perhaps heightened attention to police officer use of force in the United States, given lower perhaps deservingness of police officers as compared to perhaps vulnerable members of communities for, again, deserving protection. And lastly, we really wanted to think about agency capacity. This is something that, as scholars of public policy and public administration and political science, we think about a lot, but we weren't sure how much this was salient or important to members of the public. It doesn't matter whether public agencies have the training, the staff, the resources to deploy these tools effectively. So we wanted to explore this directly in our survey experiment to test this idea, to probe this documented association between capacity and trust in government. Does this extend to government use of AI as well? So we hypothesized that there would be lower support amongst members of the public when capacity is a stated concern for agencies to deploy AI systems. All right, so I'll briefly go through the setup of our survey experiment. We conducted an online survey experiment, again involving almost 4,200 respondents. These respondents were recruited by a polling organization in the United States called Data for Progress. And we conducted this survey between November 2021 and January of 2022. The sample is weighted to be representative of likely American voters by age, gender, education, race, and voting history. So although survey experimental results aren't perfectly and always externally valid, we think that at least the sample that we were able to obtain in this study is fairly representative of the general American public. To explore these institutional factors, the three that I highlighted before, we used a 2x2x2 factorial design, where each dimension is one of our three institutional factors. So first, for bureaucratic proximity, we varied this hypothetical presentation of police use of AI to describe how a local sheriff or the FBI would be implementing AI. For the algorithmic target, we again thought about an external versus an internal use case. We either described a situation in which the police were using AI tools for predictive policing, where again, the public are targets of the decisions and recommendations by AI, or the alternative case was automated review of case files to detect officer misconduct. And again, here, the idea is that police officers are the targets of the decisions and recommendations of AI systems. And lastly, we included a consideration about agency capacity. There was either a statement that the agency doesn't currently have enough resources or in-house expertise to fully use the new tool, or no such statement. So to give you an example of what one of our vignettes looked like, here is the vignette that we presented to individuals in our survey that included the local sheriff, the predictive policing, and the agency capacity concern treatments. Imagine that your local sheriff's office is considering using an artificial intelligence AI-based tool to predict where crime is likely to occur, helping them determine where to send officers in order to prevent crime. But some researchers and nonprofit organizations argue that these AI systems may be prone to errors and may violate individual privacy without actually reducing crime. I'll note that that caveat is held consistent across all of our treatments. We wanted to make sure that we presented both a benefit as well as a potential drawback of use of these tools. And then in this vignette where agency capacity is a concern, we state that the sheriff's office has also noted that it doesn't currently have enough resources and in-house expertise to fully use the new tool, but that it hopes to in the future. And so we explored, after presenting these vignettes, how they impacted individuals' support for the sheriff or FBI plan to use the new tool, their trust in the sheriff or the FBI to use the tool responsibly, their willingness to pay more in taxes to fund the tool, and their willingness to allow access to even their own personal data to improve the accuracy of the tool. These last two outcomes we thought were really important because the first two are just attitudinal impacts. They're sort of getting at changes in preferences. And while outcomes 3 and 4 aren't directly measures of behavior, they are directly related to potential behavioral outcomes that could occur in the real world. If we think that agency capacity is a potential issue here, do we see changes in willingness to support providing the data and the money to create agency capacity? So that's the motivation for those last two outcomes. All right, so to discuss the results, I'll first describe that we analyzed our results using regression, and so I'll be presenting either regression tables or coefficient plots describing the results. First up, I'm going to discuss the results for bureaucratic proximity, that first institutional factor that we explored. So we have here the impact of it being the sheriff who's implementing the AI tool relative to the FBI. So the FBI is sort of the reference for this whole progression. And as you see, we have the 4 outcomes: support, trust, taxes, and data in our experiment. So the big takeaway here, as you can see, is that when presented with a sheriff who's hypothetically using an AI tool as compared to the FBI, individuals are much more willing to trust, much more willing to contribute their taxes and data, and marginally more likely to support use of AI by the sheriff. It's really surprising that we found such an impact on individuals' willingness to contribute tax funding and their own personal data in the context of this online survey experiment. And I'll note that these outcomes or these impacts are on the 5-point Likert scale that these outcomes were measured along. But they're also quite close to standardized effects, given that the standard deviation for the outcomes was close to 1. So for example, the trust outcome, we notice more than a quarter of a standard deviation increase in support for use of these AI tools, which is quite large in the context of public opinion survey experimental research here. To dive into the results a little bit deeper, we notice that these impacts occur across the entire partisanship spectrum. So it's not just Democrats or not just Republicans that preferred local use of AI. It's Democrats all the way to Republicans who have this preference. Although we do notice that there's increasing preferences for local control as individuals are more likely to identify as Republicans. We also find, as you might expect, that there is a correlation between individuals' trust and their preferences for sharing taxes and data. So I think that could be a driver of the results that we see there. And to sort of give you a sense of the magnitude of these impacts, we noticed a reduction from 42% to 35% for individuals strongly opposed to providing taxes or data. So in the FBI case, 42% of individuals said, no way am I providing taxes or data to the FBI to allow them to use this AI tool. But that opposition reduced to only 35% for local sheriffs. The caveat here is that we still don't see high levels of support for use of AI tools by either the sheriff or the FBI in this context. So on the 5-point Likert scale, where 3 is sort of the middle of the way reference point, individuals are still more on the side of not approving or not supporting law enforcement use of AI. For the algorithmic targets, we see here in the aggregate really no impact, or we very strongly expected there to be an impact. So across all of our outcomes that we explored, internal versus external uses of AI tools did not make a difference on public attitudes. Now, you might be expecting that there are subgroup differences or heterogeneous preferences that just aggregating everyone together might mask. So we dive into that next. So we first looked at heterogeneous effects with regards to partisanship. So we find that across all 4 of our outcomes, as individuals become more conservative, more likely to identify with the Republican Party in the United States, they're more likely to prefer external predictive policing applications as opposed to internal applications on police officers themselves. But the interesting thing here is that even though there's a difference in relative preferences, where conservatives are more likely to prefer predictive policing, in terms of the baseline support, Democrats are actually more likely to support both use cases of AI in law enforcement. So the average support for internal review for applications in which police officers are the targets, we have higher support on the 5-point Likert scale for Democrats as compared to Republicans, and the same thing for predictive policing. I'll note that this is strongly statistically significant. And even the case when in the United States, Democrats have lower feelings toward the police as measured on a feeling thermometer. So we think that this is very strong evidence pointing to this baseline trust, baseline expectations, baseline attitudes toward public sector officials, right? When Democrats have lower feelings toward the police, more concerns about police officer misconduct, they might be more supportive of an alternative where AI is making more of the decisions, has more of the discretion in law enforcement. So again, really pointing to the fact that it's the institutional context, the actors who are implementing AI tools, and public relationships with those actors that matter for thinking about public government relationships when AI is involved. We also explore heterogeneous effects with regards to race, given a long history of differential treatment by individuals of color in the United States in regards to law enforcement. We expected that Black individuals would have different preferences from non-Black individuals. And we see some evidence of that in the top left coefficient plot. You'll notice that Black individuals have much lower support for predictive policing. Again, applications where members of the public are targets than non-Black individuals. But in many of the other instances, we don't actually find significant differences between Black and non-Black individuals in terms of their preferences for AI and law enforcement. And lastly, for agency capacity, this is an area too where we thought that explicitly stating that an agency doesn't have the resources, doesn't have the expertise to use AI tools would matter to members of the public. But we don't find that here, as our coefficient plot indicates. Comparing responses to vignettes where agency capacity was directly a concern to those where it wasn't, there's no change in public support for AI and law enforcement, trust, and willingness to contribute taxes and data. And I'll note that this also isn't something that differs when we look at sheriff versus FBI use cases. So we thought that there might be heterogeneous preferences given that local sheriffs in the US are much less well-resourced than the FBI. So if capacity concerns were to be especially salient, it might be so in the case of local sheriffs, but we don't find that's the case. So this is, again, one of those examples that I pointed to at the beginning where some of these theoretically important factors that we all talk about, we need to have transparent, we need to have explainable, we need to have, open source code, for example, even too, and in conversations around AI tools. We need to have agency capacity to implement AI tools. These might not resonate as much with members of the public as we might expect. So what are the takeaways? Some of our big takeaways here are that some institutional factors, like bureaucratic proximity, matter more to the public, while others, in the case of our study, algorithmic targets and agency capacity, are less important. And as I previewed, the finding where there's higher liberal support for both use cases of AI and policing really points to this idea that baseline trust in institutions and the opinions of actors matter for generating public support, or at least preventing public backlash or protest against AI in government. And as I noted, this is just the beginning of what we hope will be a fruitful line of literature examining contextual and institutional factors impacting AI use in government. But more work is obviously needed to more fully develop the entire inventory of potential factors that might be important here. What does this mean for policing? We find that there is this strong preference for local control of advanced technologies and law enforcement. So if the public is more trusting and more accepting of local level law enforcement's use of AI, what does that mean for the supports, for the resources that we provide to local law enforcement to help make that happen responsibly and ethically? It is interesting that we find that existing agency capacity and the intended use cases may not be barriers to AI adoption and policing as much as we might expect. We do find some willingness to fund and contribute data toward local use of AI in law enforcement. So that might support, again, that first point where if there is local support or support for local uses, how can we get to the point where there's sufficient capacity to do so well? But I'll note that there is the need to examine these results in different contexts and to consider different policing institutional structures, both within the United States as well as internationally. And so as I promised, I'll talk a little bit about the current work that we're doing to extend this study. So we are currently working on a project funded by the US National Institute of Justice, NIJ, to collect data on police use of AI and technology, as well as civilian oversight institutions, civilian review boards, CRBs. We think that this is something that we need to have much richer data to study really well, to understand variation and underlying dimensions in both police accountability, police outcomes, and police use of AI and technology. So we have gotten really detailed data for about 130 police departments so far, including data on the powers that their civilian oversight institutions have, if they do have such institutions, and which types of technologies, which types of AI applications are they using. In regards to institutional factors, we're, as I mentioned, collecting information on CRB structure, the membership composition, how frequently they meet, sort of what their organizing documents or charters contain to establish these organizations. We're collecting data on police executive turnover and how that impacts police policies and outcomes, as well as information on city-level politics and existing police performance in terms of their use of force. In regards to AI and technology, we're collecting data on all of the different use cases that might be relevant to law enforcement AI use, so facial recognition or even automated report writing. We're collecting data on which vendors, which suppliers of AI tools are law enforcement agencies in the United States using, over what timeframes are they adopting or potentially even rolling back as well use of some of these tools. And when possible, we're trying to collect information on the policies that these departments are putting forth regarding AI use, as well as any staff that they might have to specifically govern or provide technical expertise on the topic of AI. So on the topic of civilian oversight of policing, we've found so far at least, and we've been working from the largest cities down, so these results will be skewed more toward larger cities in the United States. About 63% of large cities with data collected so far have civilian review boards. And again, these are entities in which members of the public sit on these boards and review instances of misconduct or review instances in which officer behavior may be problematic. And we found that the powers of these civilian review boards vary quite a lot. So about 87% of the individual CRBs that we've looked at have the power to at least review instances of officer misconduct. Less than half of them have the power to independently investigate instances of misconduct. 64% have the ability to recommend potential discipline in instances of misconduct, but a much lower rate, only 7%, have the ability to actually impose discipline. And then lastly, we've been collecting data again on AI use in policing. And so as the bar plot indicates, there's quite high use of camera technology for collecting surveillance data in the United States. This includes body cameras, public cameras out in the community, license plate readers on police vehicles, and drones, as well as dash cams too. We see slightly higher than 50% use of predictive policing, so one of the actual use cases that we had in our study. Similarly, slightly higher than 50% use of facial recognition among law enforcement agencies in the United States, but much lower use of some of the new AI-related tools that are coming out, including automated review of police officer body cam footage, chatbots for helping police officers with their report writing or otherwise language-producing work component of their jobs. And only 1% of the agencies, I think this is about 2 agencies in our sample so far, are using AI for automated report writing to try and alleviate some of that burden on police officers. So with that, I will thank you for listening to my presentation. I look forward to all of your comments, your suggestions, your ideas for how to extend this work, and any other ideas that you might have about what we can do next with this project. Thank you.
Thank you, Kaylyn. for your interesting and insightful presentation. Could you explain you already mentioned and compared the local sheriff and FBI, but FBI for the federal government. Local sheriff is for local government. How about the state police?
That is a good question. We did not examine difference in preferences for the state police in our study, but we would expect that it would fall somewhere. Sorry, one second. We would expect that it would fall somewhere between the local and the federal level, where given the literature on trust in lower level institutions, as well as the concept of community embeddedness, there might be greater support and trust in state law enforcement as compared to federal, but perhaps less so when compared to local. But definitely something that we could continue to explore.
I give her 15 minutes
Yes.
to Professor.
Yes, thank you, Kaylyn, for insightful and informative presentation. When your paper was posted on the online PAR site, I read that and I had many questions about that. It's very good opportunity for me to learn about your paper and your research and the AI adoption in U.S. institutions. And I believe that this is very good informative paper. So I will let my student read this paper in my class, first of all. I would like to ask you some methodological issues. As you know very well, this is the kind of experiment, the perception experiment. So you should, maybe I believe that you distribute a kind of the survey, which contains a big net, and then the participants of this experiment answer to the questions or questionnaire. So in this case, it is very important to randomly assign to the control group and experimental group. So please let us know more details. Process of the random assignment of the both groups. So how to make both groups comparable and to control the third variable. So, and then second question is about the AI aversion and AI appreciation. According to some papers and some previous literature, people laypersons seem to have a kind of AI aversion, and that means people don't prefer the AI, have not preferred AI-based advice to the human-based advice. And others argue that no, there would be AI appreciation, that is, people and laypersons especially prefer the AI-based advice to the human-based advice. How can you understand the result of this paper from the viewpoint of AI aversion versus AI appreciation? Well, in my opinion, this paper said, I may say, well, people don't have any kind of specific attitude toward AI services. It is dependent on the situation and the contextual factors. It means that it is very, very contingent in many factors. So I'm wondering, what is your position, what is your opinion of this paper's result from the viewpoint of AI aversion, AI appreciations? Thirdly, the role of human factors in adopting and using AI services. These days, as far as I understand, PA literature have two kinds of the broader perspectives on AI adoption in public organization. On the one hand, some argue that, okay, AI is coming, so it means that Terminator is coming, so we should prepare such kinds of nightmare. Others, which is based on these kinds of experiments, no. People accept AI services very, very independently. Your research is in the line of that. So that is, people don't worry about that. People independently accept those kinds of AI adoption. They interpret the power of AI from the viewpoint of their own viewpoint and based on their own context, their situation. How can we understand these gaps of the academic gaps between AI nightmare and AI independent acceptance? And furthermore, what is the implication of your research on these kinds of academic gaps? Yes, and finally, implications. If your research is maybe right, we don't understand, I believe we have not too much pay attention to the governance or regulation of the AI because people, especially layperson, understand their own AI services and interpret and evaluate AI services from their viewpoint. Furthermore, there are so many kinds of the obstacles and constraints, such as institutional perspectives, such as their own bias and their own perception and their own. So it result implicate that we don't have regulation and governance system on the AI control. We should pay attention to the digital literacy of the citizens and the users. What do you think about that point? Furthermore, you said in the presentation, you said that public attitude is very matters. You said, really? AI adoption is very difficult job. Technologically, we need a technological knowledge and information. But more, we need administrative knowledge and information which AI services were and have been embedded. Layperson will not have such kinds of the level of knowledge. Then, most important thing is not layperson. I believe that professionals who were engaged in the AI adoption process in public organization. So, layperson's attitude, very important in terms of the democratic control of the government. But AI control, for the AI control, it is more important, I believe, professional attitude, professionals in this field is more important or more critical for this field. So I would like to ask you your own opinion about that. Thank you, and I'll enjoy your research and keep in touch for your research, external validity of your research. So I would like to apply your research framework to the Korean policing departments and local level and federal, central level. Thank you again.
Thank you, Professor. You made lots of comments and raised lots of questions. Okay, your response.
Thank you so much for all of these wonderful comments and questions. I wrote down as many as I could, and I hope that I'll be able to touch on all of them. But let me know if I've forgotten something. Okay, so to go in order, your first question was in regards to the survey methodology and the randomization that was done. So you're absolutely right. One of the most important things when doing an experiment, including online survey experiments like this, is that individuals are randomly assigned to the different treatments so that you don't have a situation where there's some factor, some demographic, some attribute of the individuals that determines which kind of information that they get and therefore how they respond to the treatments. And so we used the Qualtrics online survey platform to do our survey. And when individuals came in to take the survey, based on accessing the Qualtrics survey platform, they were randomly and completely independently of any information about their backgrounds, their attributes, assigned to one of our 8 vignettes. So we had a 2x2x2 experiment, so we had 8 different vignettes. And this meant that when we looked at the breakdown of the covariates or the demographics of the individuals in our study, there weren't any differences by age, by gender, by any sort of, for example, prior experiences with law enforcement that would shape their perceptions of the treatment in a way that's systematically different across the treatment groups. So we did some careful work that should be in the appendix for the paper to look at balance across our treatment groups and to assure that it was the case that there wasn't something wrong with our randomization strategy where, for example, you might be concerned that everyone in the local treatment group was people of a certain type that would prefer that kind of law enforcement. So exactly right, randomization is key here, and we believe that it was conducted successfully in the context of our study. The next question that you asked about is really interesting and important, and this relates to the concept of AI aversion versus AI appreciation. And we think about this a lot in the survey work that we do. Daniel previewed yesterday that we are building what we're tentatively calling the AI Survey and Public Attitudes Hub to collect information across tons of surveys, tons of survey experiments on public attitudes toward AI. I think we have definitely over 1,500 unique questions so far in our data set. And techno-aversion, techno-appreciation are questions that are very frequently asked, right? Daniel and I have a question that we ask almost every survey that we run that gets at this concept. But to apply it to this particular study, it's very interesting at the base level. For example, some of those results about support, we found that there might be a little bit of techno-aversion, right? There was below the middle of the road answer, leaning more toward lack of support for AI use in policing. But if you looked at some of those examples of Democratic individuals and their baseline preferences for both use cases, they had definitely higher than Republicans a level of support for use of AI in law enforcement that might actually, not definitively, because these results aren't as causally identified as the others, given that they're based on covariates, but they might point toward a level of AI appreciation, again, relative to their baseline trust and expectations in the human actors in these agencies, right? So I think this is something really important to continue to explore. It's something that we're hoping to do with this additional data that we're collecting. But I think contextualizing our results in that way is a really helpful frame for thinking about what the broader implications and impacts are. Okay. You asked about sort of the academic gaps and sort of what our research has to say about, again, this broader point about what the literature might predict and what we actually find in practice in society, right? And we find an example where there might be one of those gaps, again, in regards to agency capacity, right? I discussed that this is something that we all talk about, that is something that needs to happen, and it needs to be an important point of conversation. It's something that administrators, that bureaucrats are thinking about quite heavily. And the fact that the public isn't thinking about this as strongly leads into one of your other points about digital literacy and also the extent to which public attitudes matter here, right? Is it problematic that the public thinks that agency capacity isn't as big of a factor here? Is it problematic that levels of digital literacy are quite low in society? I would say yes, right? So what are the implications? What are the real world impacts of this research? They suggest that if we are going to have public consultation, public involvement in conversations around government use of AI, this needs to be accompanied by digital literacy, AI literacy efforts, as well as basic literacy efforts around government processes and government policies. It would be really interesting to explore, to complement this work, what people think agency capacity actually means in the context of AI deployment and adoption, right? What do they think makes a sufficiently qualified resource and staffed agency to deploy AI? This actually segues really nicely into your point about the implications around governance and public participation too. This is something that I think about a lot, that we think about a lot. If there are all these calls to increase the level of public involvement and conversation about AI in government, what might make those conversations successful? What might make for informed public dialogue? And so, again, having things around digital literacy, AI literacy, talking about what capacity even means, providing the details, the specifics to members of the public, I think is really important there. And in the context of our particular study, I sort of frame the results in going through the conversation around what this means for local level law enforcement. But we can flip it too and think about what the implications are for national level law enforcement. If people have a demonstrated preference from our work for local level law enforcement, can we make national level law enforcement more approachable, more trustworthy, more connected to members of the public, such that they feel a better sense of connectedness, community embeddedness, trust? So this might entail things like public dialogues, public consultation around national level use, visits between national level government officials and local communities, or other public comment processes that decrease the separation between local communities and national level law enforcement. You brought up an excellent point around the importance of public administrators and the fact that the public might not be the most important actor. And I think this is a both and situation where, of course, we need increased understanding of bureaucrats' knowledge and capacity to implement AI tools. I mentioned that we're working on a survey of public managers on AI adoption, thinking about the factors that they perceive as barriers to AI adoption, factors that they associate with increasing their capacity to use AI effectively and responsibly. So I completely agree that this is of the utmost importance. But at the same time, we can also think about what it means to have public dialogue, public buy-in for use of AI tools in government. And then this takes me to your last point on, do public attitudes actually matter, right? And again, this is something that I think about a lot in the context of doing this work. And I think that there are a couple ways in which they do matter. One is sort of in an affirmative way, where members of the public might sort of become supportive of use of a new tool, like some of the tools that we explored in law enforcement here, and demonstrate an overwhelming support. The example of the case of Chicago, where there were citizens actively joining together to support use of ShotSpotter. But the other instance, sorry, before I move on, that would generate legitimacy, right, for the public officials who might be looking to implement these tools. It might provide a basis of trust, or at least cover perhaps for some elected officials who are thinking about deploying these tools. On the other hand, less on the affirmative side, but more on the sort of protest side of things, at least you would want to avoid a situation where public backlash occurs after deploying an AI system. So I think many elected officials, but many bureaucrats as well, wouldn't want a situation where they roll out a new technology in a law enforcement application, and then things get really bad and the public condemns the use of this tool. We've seen many examples of this, such as the Allegheny County example where an AI tool was used in child welfare services, produced a lot of problematic results. There was extreme public backlash. Even in the ShotSpotter example, there are other examples across cities where the public has successfully called for removal of that technology. So if not in the affirmative case, if there's not an AI appreciation, to go back to that point, you might want to be thinking about the opposite case of preventing protests, preventing public backlash, and preventing the AI aversion that might come along with some of these use cases. So thanks again for your wonderful comments.
In business sector, company provide a beta version. So they try and error. But in government sector, it is quite difficult. We provide the beta version to citizens or the business community. Okay, second discussant is.
Yes. Good morning. Given Professor having provided so many valuable comments and Professor Schiff having responded to those comments, there isn't, I'm afraid, much that I would contribute to the discussion. But I have the script here ready, so I'm pretty much going to read off the script I've prepared. So I am Min-Han Kim. I am a professor at Sangmin University, researching and teaching students there. First of all, I thank Professor Dongwook Kim for the invite, and also our friends from the US and Belgium yesterday for their participation in this wonderful workshop. It's my pleasure to make comments and share my thoughts on the paper, on the study by Professor Schiff titled Institutional Factors Driving Citizens' Perceptions of AI in Government, Evidence from a Survey Experiment and Policing. I think this research addresses a timely and significant issue, which is the public's perception of AI in government, particularly in the domain of law enforcement. The authors investigate how bureaucratic proximity, algorithmic targets, and agency capacity shape citizen attitudes towards AI use in policing. Let me briefly summarize the key findings of their study. There are three primary findings. First, on bureaucratic proximity. Second, on algorithmic targets. And last but not least, agency capacity. As for the bureaucratic proximity, the public significantly prefers local law enforcement, like sheriffs, over national agencies such as the FBI for AI implementation. I think this preference is linked to greater trust in local authorities, reflected in a higher willingness to support financially and share personal data. My very brief thoughts on this would be that the findings would be very contradictory in the South Korean context, because the South Korean population would actually have a greater trust in the national government rather than local, which this is all the more reason we should definitely pursue something comparative rather than a single country case study. And as for the algorithmic targets, overall, there is no significant difference in public support between AI targeting the public, predictive policing, and AI targeting internal police misconduct. And as for the agent's capacity, surprisingly, the public support for AI is not significantly affected by the agency's perceived capacity to implement AI tools effectively. I thought this sort of suggests a disconnect between theoretical importance and public perceptions. In other words, academics' attention would very much vary from what the, as Professor termed, lay people's attention and thoughts and concerns. So let me further elaborate for the critical evaluation of the study on the bureaucratic proximity. The finding that local law enforcement is preferred for national agencies is compelling. It resonates with the literature and trust in local versus national government, especially in the American politics context, highlighting the importance of community embeddedness. And one future venue of research would be that the study might further explore the underlying reasons for this trust. Is it solely about physical proximity, or are there other factors such as local accountability mechanisms, historical performance of local law enforcement, or personal interactions, between those police enforcement and those people that drive this trust? Additionally, how do media portrayals of local versus national law enforcement influence these perceptions? This is an area ripe for future qualitative or quantitative research. I do have a lot more as for the elaboration of my personal thoughts and feelings about the paper, but it's just like way too much. So let me just get onto the what I had prepared for the conclusion of my review of the paper. In sum, the study by Professor Schiff makes a significant contribution to our understanding of public perceptions of AI in government, especially in the contentious area of law enforcement, which I thought was like really fascinating, that that very specific domain within the public sector, that and that's got really to do with so to speak, street level bureaucracy. This was really fascinating. It highlights the importance of institutional context, bureaucratic proximity, algorithmic targets, and agency capacity in shaping these perceptions. Moving forward, scholars and practitioners must consider these factors, again, bureaucratic proximity, algorithmic targets, and agency capacity in designing and implementing AI systems in government. By doing so, we can better align these systems with public expectations and values, thereby enhancing their legitimacy. There are always that legitimacy concerns, right? Along with effectiveness concerns too. So future research directions, I would like to make a few suggestions. The study provides a foundation for several avenues of future research. One important area is to explore how different types of AI applications in law enforcement are perceived. For instance, how does the public view AI in traffic management compared to AI in crime prediction? Because in the context of South Korea, traffic management by the police, by the law enforcement, that takes up a very big portion of their everyday police management, and people's perception on that would actually matter more maybe than crime prediction or crime management. As far as the volume of their work is concerned, that would actually bear a greater importance maybe. So I think this sort of distinction in the public view would actually matter, especially in the South Korean context. And also, are there differences in trust and support based on the perceived intrusiveness of the technology? And another important direction is to examine the role of transparency in AI implementation. How does the provision of information about how AI systems work, their benefits, and potential risks influence public support? Can greater transparency mitigate concerns about misuse and increased trust? These are some generic questions. Maybe that's got to do with AI development and application. But as Professor Kim has briefly mentioned, not much mistake would be allowed within the public domain. That's one critical issue there. In the business sector, maybe the market deals with it. So when you fail with your technologies, then you would be this may be a bit extreme term, but you might be expelled from the market, right? But you don't often get second chances within the public sector. That would be one of the reasons we would have to be more prudent, especially with developing and especially implementing those technologies within the for the practice. Yes. Well, many of these suggestions and comments I have just made, I think I thought were relevant for the future research for Professors Schiff, of which Professor Schiff, Lady Schiff, has answered already, much of them, as a response to Professor comments. Anyways, my closing remarks would be that thank you for everyone's attentions, and the findings of this study underscore the complexity of integrating AI into public administration, particularly in sensitive areas like law enforcement. Again, thank you for listening to my brief discussion, thoughts, and feelings about the paper. And I very much look forward to the discussion that follows my discussion, and I very much look forward to the future relevance research that Professors Schiff pursue in the future. Thanks.
Transparency in public sector is highly related to the trustworthy and so you already mentioned. So any response?
Thank you so much for these excellent comments. Definitely don't sell yourself short, because these were wonderful, wonderful comments that have given me a lot to think about and really point to a lot of fruitful directions for future research. So I really appreciate all of these. So to go through some of your comments. So first, you were discussing the comparison between the US case and the case of Korea. Given that there's greater trust in national level law enforcement in Korea. And we actually had a competing expectation for our hypothesis about local preferences, where it was possible that we would find a preference for the FBI use of AI, even though a lot of the literature in the US context shows greater trust in local level policy implementation. For something as technical as AI, we thought that there might be a case where national level agencies, especially thinking about the context of capacity as well, where the even more well-staffed, well-resourced, already proficient in technology case of the FBI would be preferred. So it is something that sort of went against our expectations there. But to further the conversation about the comparison between the US and Korea, we picked policing because we thought that we recognize that it is an area that's quite contentious in the US, where there might really be institutional factors, baseline trust that drive public attitudes here. So either after I finish this round of comments or at some point in our conversation, I would love to hear your or anyone else's thoughts about what might be the contentious areas in the context of Korea, where public attitudes about either the context, the institution, the actors who are implementing AI would be really important. So that's the first thing. Another comment that you had was encouraging us to probe the mechanisms behind greater trust. And I think that's an excellent suggestion. You bring up the idea of local accountability. And this is something that really could matter. So if you're thinking about the context of sheriff deployment of AI tools, in the case of the US, sheriffs are almost all directly elected by communities. So there is a direct accountability mechanism where if sheriffs deploy AI in a way that the public is not happy with, they could remove a sheriff from their position, right? Or even without the electoral mechanism, perhaps through the media, as you mentioned as well, or perhaps through other public forums and avenues for public comment in politics. There's a more direct channel to the preferences of that community being represented in the outcomes of law enforcement. In the opposite case, if you have the FBI use, if there's one particular or national level use, just to be general, if there's one particular community that's especially harmed by FBI use of AI, there's not much that they could do on their own unless they're a community like New York City. They're large enough, prominent enough that they're able to make a splash on the national stage. So this tether, this tie between community say or community control over the actors or the implementation of AI is a really important dimension. So I thank you for raising that. You asked about different types of AI applications and citizen perceptions about those. This is really important as well. And of course, when we're designing experiments, you have to, for the sake of the size of the sample that you're able to obtain and the cost that you put into it, limit all of the possible dimensions that you'd want to explore, right? And so going back to the previous comments, we had wanted to potentially assess human versus AI versus combined human and AI interaction. That's been extensively studied. Not to say that the question's done, but there's been a lot of prior work on that in public administration, so we had to leave it to the side for a second. We also could have explored many other AI applications, but had to limit ourselves in the context of this experiment. But I will mention that in an experiment that we're working on right now, thinking about public perceptions toward auditing of AI systems, we're thinking about different AI use cases there, where you might have more neutral applications. And we're thinking about AI for spam filtering. And we saw an example of that from the EU AI Act, sort of lowest risk, no risk sort of tier that's similar to traffic management. Or you might have situations that are less neutral, that more directly implicate individuals or groups. And there's some excellent research by a colleague of ours, Shir Raviv, that's looking at how AI use cases might affect individuals versus groups. And they might also sort of benefit individuals or sanction individuals, might bestow benefits or burdens. And so that's an important distinction that we're thinking about a lot as we use AI use cases in our extended research. Perceived intrusiveness is really important as well. And so in related work too, we're looking at sort of AI in healthcare settings where there might be direct intrusiveness in your life or in your medical care versus in things, again, like spam filtering, where it's less directly intrusive. You bring up the point around transparency in AI implementation, which of course is really big. And all of these conversations around public consultation, public and other stakeholder involvement, transparency is almost a prerequisite to that, right? How much conversation can you have if there's not a lot of transparency involved? Interestingly, in some of those studies that I highlighted in the related literature, transparency is one of the dimensions that sort of mattered less to the public. So I think that there's a lot more work that needs to be done investigating the types of transparency or how transparency actually occurs, what that means, what information is actually provided to be able to understand that dimension better and to effectively facilitate public participation. My last note here is that I'm happy to hear more. You said that you had so many other comments. I would love to hear all of your reactions to our work. So maybe we can find a time to chat more about that later. Thanks.
It's an interesting chart. The page 63. Yeah. In the US, body cam is the most, they have the most cases. But in Korea, public cams, we call the CCTV and parade readers. So lots of CCTV, roads and streets is widely spread. Even in the buildings, lots of CCTV. So Korean people less sensitive to the CCTV concern, less concerned their own privacy compared to the Western countries people. So sometimes body cam protect police person, law enforcement officers, but through the using the body cams, we can control the misconduct of the police law enforcement towards citizens or some dangerous people. So it's a interesting chart. But now, this time, the Korean police cannot use body cams. Body cam usage is very exceptional in Korea. So, yeah, we're waiting the lots of comment and question from pros. So raise your hands. Okay, Adam.
Thank you. So I'm going to commit a bit of a heresy in political science and ask you of the value of doing this as an experiment as opposed to an observational study. And the reason that I'm thinking about this is that particularly on the question of trust, right? So there is kind of an implicit, I feel like, assumption that local equals trust and distant equals less trust. And you do see some of that in your response, but obviously there is room for heterogeneity in that effect, that for certain people, local might be less trustworthy than the FBI. I would think, if you think of the history of, African Americans in the South, right, the FBI was more trusted to crack down on the KKK than the local police would have been, and vice versa for white people in that context. And so I wonder, I would be interested to see just an observational study of what are the pre-existing baselines of trust, and then of those who trust one institution or another, do they support or not AI focused against them or by them on the public? So do those who trust the local government oppose the use of AI against the local police? Things like that, just to kind of take those pre-existing baselines as given. Obviously, you lose some of the causal identification, but I feel like trust is so closely causally related to the outcome that you're interested in that I think you could get away with some of that, because you might say, okay, well, white people have higher trust and have higher support of AI, but what's the alternative channel, right? It's going through trust probably anyway. So is it okay? I think it would be okay to do that. And so I would just be curious to see, again, also because the target of the AI seems to be kind of inversely related to the trust you have in that institution, that if you trust them, you're more willing to have them use AI against you. If you don't trust them, you're more likely to support AI used against them, kind of on your behalf. And I feel like with an observational study, you could do a bit more of those crosstabs without the worry of the 6 cells, or what is it, 9 cells of your conjoined experiment here. You mentioned the sheriffs being elected. I feel like that's also an important potential element there. And yeah, so I just would be kind of interested to see some more direct measurements of trust as opposed to kind of through association with the local or non-local. If you wanted to continue to do this as an experiment, well, I mean, you've already done this as a different experiment. I'd also be curious about maybe local police forces as opposed to sheriffs, simply because while local police are more electorally accountable, it's less of the direct line that you have say over the mayor, who has some say over the police, but as we know in the US at least, only in complete control of mayors over their own local police, that might give you a bit more comparability on this question of is it physical proximity or is it kind of accountability mechanisms that you feel you have over the local law enforcement. But anyway, yeah, very interesting topic. Thank you.
Thanks so much for these comments, and thanks for previewing some of our other research agenda as well. We are thinking about a lot of these questions, and we agree in principle that experimental work, can't answer all of the questions, particularly ones around mechanisms and ones around sort of the deeper levels and layers involved in trust. And so we're doing a lot of work in sort of observational data collection. We described here, at the end, previewing all the work that we're doing on collection of data on law enforcement use of technology, law enforcement, political policy, turnover-related outcomes, and we need to bring into that as well, perhaps some survey and otherwise, if there are some existing measures that we can tap into trust in sort of this observational context, we're looking to do that as well. In some surveys that we're working on right now, we're trying to probe trust in a couple of different ways, and definitely excited to hear if you have other suggestions, given that we can, these are experiments and surveys that we're working on right now, so we can add some new measures into them. In regards to sort of like baseline trust in law enforcement, we've included questions such as asking individuals to rate the job that their local police department's doing in terms of managing crime, in terms of using the right level of force, for example, in certain circumstances. We've asked about individuals' prior personal or either through family members or friends level of contact with law enforcement, to think again about those experiences and personal connections. We asked that police feeling thermometer question that I mentioned in the study, and we ran the study through Data for Progress, as I mentioned, so we were a little bit unfortunately limited in the number of extra questions that we could throw on there. In our studies that we're working on right now, we have a fuller battery of questions related to trust, pre-existing relationships, prior contact and involvement with law enforcement. For the sheriff election piece, we have, although this is from the perspective of bureaucrats rather than the public, we have another piece that's coming out soon in JPAM, the Journal of Public Analysis and Management, that looks at differences between elected sheriffs and almost all appointed police chiefs and their responsiveness to public opinion on, in this case, on civilian oversight. Although there definitely could be direct parallels to their willingness to be responsive to members of the public on AI and technology use as well. And so we find that paradoxically, sheriffs who are more directly elected are less responsive to public opinion than you would think. And in analyzing sort of the open-ended responses that these individuals provided on their surveys, they say that, oh, well, elections are my direct accountability mechanism. I don't need to attend to public opinion in these other ways, because if they don't like it, they'll just throw me out of office, which is, of course, the mechanism that we were just talking about here, too. But so this...
Don't many of them run unopposed?
They do. That's another complexity, too. So yeah, we explore that as well. That's sort of the... And even if they're running against a challenger, the incumbency advantage is huge. So the extent to which elections are actually effective accountability mechanisms is in question, even though they say that they are their effective check, right? So yeah, we are definitely trying to think more about variation between different types of local level law enforcement, sheriffs versus municipal police agencies, what the accountability features are, what the multi-level accountability features through the mayor for appointed police chiefs, for example, to members of the public might entail. So yeah, thanks for those questions.
Usually the elected official as concern the public opinion only during the election campaign period. Okay. So Professor Ji-Suk Woo, you might,
Yeah. Thank you. I don't have a lot to add because Professor and Professor Kim made such great comments already. I just want to thank Professor Kim first for organizing this wonderful seminar. I wasn't able to come yesterday, but I listened to your presentation, Mr. Daniel. And it was so insightful, and especially from a person who has like social science and also law background. Your like line of thoughts and approaches were really, really refreshing. And coming back to today's presentation, I particularly like the way you laid out the institutional factors that we can have some influence and we can actually expect some actors' involvement as compared to technological features such as explainability and transparency that are not very easy to control. We always talk about explainability and AI transparency as if it's something that we can just enforce and demand. So we always have all these action guidelines that talk about transparency, but as we all know, the AI technology itself makes it really difficult for the companies or developers to provide this explainability and transparency. And similarly, I also think that your focus on agency capacity was a really important one, but you found your findings actually suggest that all these factors, technological features and agency capacity, are not as important as we thought. And I think it's a very good news, very good, because whenever we talk about explainability and transparency, we have headache and dizziness because like we go to deadlock with these factors. And going back to your major finding that you found the preference for local use. So proximity is really important. And as Professor Kim said, like from the point of view of policy implications, it's really important to think about what it really means. And you already mentioned that it's not just geological concept. So it could be like involvement or like actors' experiences with each other. So I think there are tons of important research questions that you could further approach. And actually, I have a student at GSPA. Her name is Ji-Soo-Kim, and we are actually working on the concept of trust, AI trust, and we are actually going into that area that we think that trust is not something that can be just enforced or demanded, but it's something that has to be built. We are focusing on researching on the process of AI trust building. So I think we could probably collaborate down the road. And thank you very much for your presentation.
Thanks so much for these comments. And I'll start with the last one and say I would love to chat more with you and your students on developing a more nuanced understanding of what AI trust entails. And I think, the contribution of this work and something that you're probably already thinking about is that it's not just trust in the tool, the model, or the algorithm, but trust in also the human actors that are involved, trust in the broader governmental context in which it's deployed. So definitely looking forward to chatting more and getting involved in that. You bring up the point that I think is a really great way to frame this, that this might be good news, that some of these institutional factors matter where technical factors might be less important, because some of these institutional factors might be under our control, right? If we're trying to make recommendations to bureaucrats about what to do here, they might have more control over institutional factors than they do over changing the inner workings or the explainability of AI systems, right? Things can be done to change agency capacity, although again, that was something that we found paradoxically didn't matter as much. Things can be done to improve connections, embeddedness, trust, community relations, public involvement, to foster proximity. Even if we might have gaps still in geographic proximity, we might be able to lessen some of those gaps with these participation mechanisms, public consultation mechanisms, information sharing mechanisms. And to that point about information sharing, I think it's worth thinking about more how transparency isn't just like the technical transparency that we all hear about with AI systems, where we need transparency regarding how the tools work and how they reach their decisions or recommendations. There's also transparency involved in the workings of the actors who are involved in deploying these tools. What transparency can we provide about human oversight, right? What steps are the human actors who are overseeing AI systems taking to ensure that they're being deployed responsibly? This relates to the conversation that we had yesterday around auditing, right? And creating governance systems for AI tools. And I think that, again, that's something that we have more control over, right? We can have a more transparent process for reporting out not only how AI tools are used, even if we can't explain exactly what they're doing, but also transparent information sharing over the relationship between the human actors and the AI tools. So thank you for those comments.
John, you have no questions?
Yeah, actually, I don't have questions. I have two suggestions. So thank you, Kaylyn, for your wonderful presentation. It was a lot of fun. And actually, since a lot of people already asked you to put a lot of different kinds of variables, I just decided to add some more. Your presentation kind of reminded me of the variables that I wanted to test out in different researches that I couldn't do yet. So as one, considering that it's about the finding out the variables that actually impact the level of support for the use of AI in the public sector, I realized that there could be like two more additional variables that you could consider. So the first one would be like the political perspective, the trust about the political system itself directly. That was one of the key variables that I had for my master dissertation. So I wrote the dissertation about Brexit, and I broke the voters into two groups, conservative and labor supporters, party supporters. And actually, like one of the variables that were statistically viable was that the ones that supported the Brexit were the ones who were very much supportive for their political system, having like very strong trust in their political system. So that was quite interesting, like regardless of their PID, they were having this like kind of very strong political system trust. So they could actually believe that Brexit would favor their country. So I thought that maybe that would be also added. And the other part is like technology exposure. So the thing is like, if you have like good experience with AI and you have good image about the AI, you would likely to support the use of the AI. That's what I thought. And there were two different studies that I'm referring to. One is the one that we had last week with Fabrizio Ghilardi. So he told us about like, there are tons of studies about AI and also media exposure about AI, and most of them are covering the negative aspect. So I was thinking, what if like you look into the media exposure for that? And also the other study is about very interesting paper, the professor that I don't remember, but it was about experience of watching drama about positive image about police officers, like NCAI, NCSI. Yeah, seriously. So she did this research, and the dependent. Yeah. Or Hawaii, whatever. Yeah. So yeah. Those kind of like exposure, like media exposure, actually had positive influence to their support for the policing system. So if we transfer that into AI technology, maybe you could like add some variables like TikTok or YouTube. You know, if they are having some experiences that can actually be affected by the use of AI technology from the government, maybe they have different kind of like attitude towards to the supporting, the level of supporting of the use of AI. So yeah, like if you are going to use that variables, I would love to talk more about it. So yeah, it'd be very much interesting, and maybe it could expand it into political communication sector as well. So, well, that's pretty much about it. Thank you very much.
Any other comments or questions? Yeah. Oh. Dr. Bob?
Okay, I also have some more research suggestion. You observe the aspect of citizens who use the AI, or police using AI. Then, does police officer or public officer trust or prefer the AI technology? I think you know, in Korea, many police prefer using a body cam because when police chase some criminals, when there is some conflict, and they believe this body cam protect some illegal some problem from the criminals. So they wanted to more using body cams always. So in that, so yeah, that kind of question I have, especially in public officer.
All right. Yes, that is a great question, and one that there is actually an existing study in the public administration literature on. And so this is sort of looking at whether police officers would buy into and prefer and use the recommendations of AI systems. And the key takeaway from this study is that police officers trusted and would use the recommendations when they agreed with what they would do already. You know, basically sort of like this, I like that AI model because it would do what I would do anyway without, you know, the intervention of this AI system. So there's sort of contingent trust and contingent preferences for AI technology amongst public officials, amongst bureaucrats. I wouldn't be surprised if this finding extended beyond police officers, right? There's a lot of expertise, experience, knowledge built up, and deference to that knowledge. And so if you have a sense that this tool is coming in and making a prediction, oh, well, that tool doesn't have the experience or the connections with the community or the on the job, on the, you know, on the line experience that I've had, why should I trust it, right? I think that there's a lot more room to continue to explore that, right? Both sort of the conditions under which you could get bureaucrats to trust recommendations that might not automatically be what they would do otherwise, as well as exploring the differences across different policy domains. And I want to briefly comment on Chie's points as well, because we do have some interesting research using some measures of trust in the political system and technology exposure in some other work, and we're including them in some forthcoming or upcoming work as well. For technology exposure, in some prior work on deepfakes, we asked a question about prior exposure to deepfakes, right? Thinking about what the implications of our survey results might be, sort of raising awareness of deepfakes, conditional upon people's pre-existing exposure and awareness of deepfakes. In some work about generative AI, we're asking about sort of the extent of their awareness and also personal use of AI chatbots when we're exploring the results of that experiment. On trust in the political system, I think there are so many dimensions here to be attentive to, right? There's political knowledge, there's political self-efficacy, there's the sense that the political system works for people like you, you know? Just to also highlight some related work in the public administration literature, our colleagues Susan Miller and Lael Kaiser have some work that's under development right now that's looking at sort of how people's perceptions about AI use in government might be conditioned by partisanship, right? So if you have a sense of the political identification or affiliation of the government officials who are deploying an AI tool, do you want them to match your partisanship, to have that shared identity, that shared sense of policy preferences too? So they're doing some excellent work looking at how that sort of institutional factor as well conditions public support.
Yeah, thank you. Apologies for double dipping. Also, just to follow up on what was just said, in the US, body cams are very much framed as a protecting the public from the police measure, but in cases where the framing is reversed, I would expect the police to have different responses to it. One thing that I wanted to push back on was on the interpretation of the results about agency capacity, because that's been mentioned a bit here, is that what was measured, as I understand it, was not directly perceptions of agency capacity. What was measured was exposure to a vignette with claims about agency capacity. And to make the leap between the two, we have to assume that the respondents perceptions of capacity were driven by the vignette and not their own experience. And I think in this context, particularly with the FBI and local government or local police, where you would have more kind of firsthand ideas about these capacity, that I wonder to what extent the respondents were actually influenced by the vignette with respect to agency capacity, and to what extent they were saying like, well, the FBI has capacity, I believe that to be the case. Even if the vignette told me the FBI doesn't have capacity, I'm just going to disregard the vignette and use my own kind of perceptions of the FBI or of my local sheriffs to frame my response. And so that's another place where I'd be curious to see, rather than using the vignette and assuming that the vignette is what's driving the perceptions of capacity, to just directly ask about capacity and see how that maps onto support more directly. Because I could imagine in this context that the vignette might not be as influential in shaping the respondent's response as it might be in other cases.
Yeah, that's a great point. I agree that agency capacity, what we're measuring here is sort of the agency's statement about their own capacity. Whereas in the real world, we might care about people's perceptions of the agency capacity of a real world agency. And this sort of was, this point about agency capacity and sort of people's baseline expectations is what drove between sheriff. Because it is possible, as you highlight, that people mad about the FBI not having capacity. And so we thought that we would pick up on significant interaction effects. And the fact that we didn't doesn't know what was happening, but maybe people were at least going on. But you're right, there's a lot more that we need to unpack there. In regards to body cams, I just want to say briefly that the reason high level of body cam use in the United States is actually a case of policy diffusion with strong professional norms and sort of associations in law enforcement in on body cams. One of our collaborators on this project, a leading expert on police body cameras in the, we learned from his experience that this was sort of, again, this policy. This is something that we're also highlighting in that forthcoming I mentioned. And I think this is also a situation professional networks and policy diffusion to these use cases of other technologies, right? With AI and other technologies and courses proliferate, those experiences via professional associations, via, for example, Municipal Chiefs Association in the United States, lead to a positive reinforcing cycle or cycle where positive experiences are shared, uptake and use of AI tools, problematic instances where police departments are facing clash, or instances where tools don't they might have expected that might be sort of like negatively reinforced of non-policy diffusion. So I think that's a
Okay, almost now. So this is the end of our global symposium. Thank you, everybody, especially presenters and the discussants and the good audience. Thank you. Thank you.